Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are plunging into, well, a really fundamental tension at the heart of faith. It's this dual mandate, summarized as looking up to Jesus, walking towards the masses. For you, this deep dive is a shortcut to understanding how that intense spiritual work actually translates into messy, real-world action.
And this material is so fascinating because it's just deeply practical. It comes from these internal reflections prepared years ago, back in 2015, specifically to guide community engagement.
So it's not just theory.
Not at all. We're moving way beyond theology class and asking,
Right.
how do we step out, with real intentionality and become effective witnesses in a world that, frankly, isn't all that interested in our internal spiritual state?
Right. So our mission today is really to unpack that duality. We have to establish that foundational identity, the internal work, before we can even look at the complex world we're called into.
Yeah.
We'll look at the temptation to just stay safe and then the character traits we need to handle all that friction. Okay, let's unpack this, starting with that upward gaze.
So the first unit is all about looking up to Jesus. This is a call to internal holiness, for sure, but also a call for external focus.
What do you mean by that, external focus?
It means we look up so we don't fall asleep, in the comfortable bubble of our own faith. We recognize Jesus as God's beloved Son, and the whole point of looking inward is to prepare us to be credible witnesses of what we've seen.
And even before we take that first step towards the community, the sources make it super clear we have this foundational identity crisis to solve.
That's the core tension. The sources lay out two central identities for a believer. First, we are the new Israelites.
Okay.
Theologically, that means we're chosen, redeemed, a new covenant. But practically, it means we live locally, like, say, in Taiwan, sharing the same culture, the same language, same heritage. But we now have this distinct spiritual recognition that sets us apart.
We're in the culture, but not of it.
Exactly. And that's the who we are part.
So what about the what we do part?
Well, that's the second identity. Being disciples of Christ, called to service. And here's the internal conflict that the material really highlights. On one hand, we're children of God, which can sound a lot like being royalty, princes and princesses who've got this privileged, saved life. But immediately, we're also called to be students, disciples, which demands just relentless humility and service.
That feels like the classic tension that trips up every single believer. How do you hold the privilege of being a child of God without getting arrogant, but keep the humility of a student without just getting burned out by duty?
That's where the classic Martha and Mary analogy is so helpful. Mary, she represents the inner life listening to Jesus, prioritizing their relationship.
Right.
And Martha represents the outer service acting with, passion and enthusiasm. If our outer service, our Martha, isn't constantly fueled by our inner listening, our Mary, we just end up serving out of obligation. Or worse, exhaustion.
The inner life has to fuel the outer mission.
It has to. It's the only way our walk toward the masses is sustainable and authentic.
Okay, that foundational balance is so critical. But let's turn to the sources analysis of the biggest temptation to break that balance, which comes from the Transfiguration. Peter, James, and John see Jesus in glory with Moses and Elijah, and Peter just blurts out, "Lord, it is good for us to be here."
His reaction is so understandable. It's genuine awe. And he proposes building 3 tents. And it's important to note, he doesn't ask for one for himself. He just wanted to respect these honored elders and basically enshrine this glorious vision forever.
And this is where the deep dive gets really interesting. The problem isn't the awe, it's the desire to build a permanent structure, a tent, around a perfect fleeting moment of glory. If they stay on that mountain, inside that theological bubble, what happens to the sick child waiting at the bottom? What happens to the whole mission of incarnation?
Exactly. The Transfiguration was brief, maybe a day. Jesus didn't stay for 40 days to, solidify the experience. But Peter wanted to capture it, to control it. And that desire to build tents links directly to our human tendency. We're so influenced by what our eyes see as good or perfect, and we want to stabilize that perfection. We want to live permanently at the high point of the spiritual retreat.
It sounds like this desire to anchor ourselves to something that looks good, even if it's spiritually dangerous, is just deeply ingrained in us. Is that why the sources pivot from the Transfiguration straight back to Genesis?
Yes, the underlying principle is identical, the danger of attraction. Peter saw glory and wanted to build. Adam and Eve saw fruit that looked good, and Lot saw land that looked good.
Tell us about the fruit.
Well, consider the forbidden fruit in Genesis 3:6. The fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was physically attractive. It looked really good for food and was desirable for gaining wisdom. The visual appeal just overrode the clear prohibition.
They touched it, ate it, and were expelled.
Yep. And then Lot's choice in Genesis 13 is the same caution, but on a grand scale. Lot got first choice of the land. And he chose the Jordan Plain because he saw it was beautiful and well-watered. He described it as being like the garden of the Lord. He chose based purely on the immediate visual promise of prosperity.
The best irrigation, the nicest view, that gives us a really modern parallel, doesn't it? It's like choosing a career or a relationship based only on how good it looks on the outside.
The beautiful, well-watered plain.
Even if that choice means a spiritual compromise or takes you away from your actual mission.
That is the key takeaway. The good thing we choose by sight, the vision we want to build a tent around, can become a fatal attraction. For Lot, that beautiful land led him directly to losing everything in Sodom and Gomorrah.
So if we bring that tent analogy into the present, we might not put Jesus on a mountaintop, but we build spiritual tents all the time. How does the modern church fall into this trap?
Well, the modern church risks becoming that very mountain tent. Instead of trying to isolate and contain this glorious transfigured Christ in some exclusive space, the church has to constantly align itself with God's true plan, which is incarnation.
The Son becoming flesh.
And dwelling among the people.
Incarnation is the ultimate refusal of the tent. It's stepping down from the mountain and into the vulnerability of the community.
And we see the risk when churches focus too much on the physical tent itself. We admire these grand, beautiful church buildings. Think of those magnificent cathedrals in Europe.
Right.
They're monuments to a glorious past. But if they prioritize the building over the mission, they risk becoming just historical sites. Tourist attractions where, tragically, the living God isn't really present among the people.
The building becomes the purpose, a spiritual fortress instead of a vehicle for the gospel.
Exactly. The building is not the purpose. The purpose is proclaiming the gospel and serving the incarnation mandate. If a church fails to move toward the masses, its focus on the building means it can't retain the incarnation anyway. You just can't lock up the active presence of God.
That shift from looking up to actively walking towards demands so much practical wisdom. It's not just theology. It's about handling the friction of the world. What are the key traits the source material says we need to do this?
The sources highlight 3 essential traits: courage, wisdom, and patience. And the analysis really emphasizes that courage is often the biggest shortfall, particularly among cultures, including Chinese and Taiwanese people, that tend toward communal harmony and risk aversion.
That's an interesting generalization. If we look at this not as a cultural flaw, but as a spiritual obstacle, how does that fear of risk, how does it show up in our spiritual life?
It shows up as this intense desire for control and a fear of confrontation. You prefer passive activities, things where the outcome is predictable and safe. Spiritually, this means we overthink the risks of service. What if I fail? What if I look foolish? What if I suffer loss? And that hesitation just prevents the faithful step outward. We prioritize self-preservation over the adventure of faith.
It's the difference between focusing on the potential danger, the fall, the argument, versus the fun or the spiritual mandate. And that mindset is fundamentally challenged when we step into a modern society defined by self-will.
It is. We need wisdom here because action without wisdom can just look inconsistent. The weather vane analogy helps.
The weather vane, it looks fickle, right? It's always changing direction, east-west.
Yet it's perfectly consistent. It always follows the prevailing wind. Believers have to be consistent in their underlying principles: love, grace, mission. Even if our actions, our engagement strategies, seem to shift based on the wind of the situation. Engagement requires skill, not just rigid dogma.
To bring this into sharp focus, the sources have this detailed case study from public transport in Taiwan, the issue of priority seating, or what they used to call the love seat.
Yes, the teal. This local conflict perfectly illustrates the challenge of yielding rights in a society obsessed with them. The tension was constant. If a young person sat there, they risked being publicly shamed, which led to this widespread resentment.
So they even rebranded the seats because the conflict was so bad.
Exactly.
Let's use the framework from the sources to analyze this because it's so powerful. It's group, law, reason, emotion versus individual, emotion, reason, law. Let's start with the group's perspective.
Okay, so the group starts with law. Everyone buys a ticket, so legally you've purchased that seat. No one has the right to demand you give it up.
The law provides no mandate for charity.
None. The group then relies on reason. The needy should logically get the seat, and finally on emotion, hoping for a willingness to yield. But the law is the foundation. Everything else is just a moral request.
Okay, now, if we're walking towards the masses as disciples, the individual believer has to reverse that order.
That is the key distinction. The believer starts with emotion compassion, the willingness to love and help the needy. That is then filtered through reason, and finally we operate outside the law. It's like Jesus saying, walk 2 miles when you're asked for one. The believer willingly yields their purchase right out of love, not legal obligation or emotional coercion.
That is such a vital distinction. If I give up my seat because I feel an elder staring me down, that's exhausting. It breeds resentment. But if I yield it willingly, out of compassion that's fueled by my inner life, that's an act of grace.
Absolutely. The sources talk about the older, slower trains where you could buy standing tickets. So if an elderly person stood right in front of you for 3 or 4 hours, you felt emotionally blackmailed into giving up your spot.
And that act of giving, born from coercion, just leads to exhaustion and complaining?
It does. And you see modern solutions changing the dynamic. When the high-speed trains started prohibiting standing tickets for safety, they also, maybe unintentionally, removed that intense emotional pressure.
Yeah, but they didn't solve the underlying problem of self-will.
No, they didn't. The courage, wisdom, and patience are required for those situations where the law doesn't require charity.
And what happens when self-will completely overrides community? The source shared a really shocking example of this.
We saw it recently. A person sitting in the wrong seat on a train just refused to move because they insisted on their purchased right, ignoring all reason, emotion, everything. It caused a 30-minute delay for that train.
Which then cascaded.
It cascaded into 40 subsequent train delays across the entire network, all because one person put their own will above basic community function. That just shows the destructive power when individuals refuse to temper their rights with any wisdom or gentleness.
That example perfectly captures the weight of this walking towards the masses mandate. It requires such profound psychological and spiritual preparation to deal with a world so focused on self-interest.
It does. You can't just instantly educate the challenging people you meet if you haven't first educated yourself in faith and wisdom and, how to practice yielding your own rights. Our ability to engage is really limited only by our inner preparation.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? Our deep dive shows that the spiritual journey demands constant movement. From the mountain of glory, the safety of our tents, to the messy, complicated reality of the community, we need courage, wisdom, and patience, not just for big evangelistic goals, but for the basic friction of modern life like who gets a seat on the train.
And we have to practice yielding our rights willingly, motivated by grace, not manipulation. As we get ready for a discussion on good behavior next week, reflect on this. If your only motivation to yield your rights, a seat, your time, a resource, is external pressure or emotional blackmail, how can that action possibly point people towards a God of true radical grace? If your act of love leaves you exhausted and complaining, the witness fails. We have to cultivate that internal capacity so our yielding is meaningful, consistent, and graceful.